In today's video, we're going to talk about the Voigtlander Brillant, which was a box camera that was becoming a TLR camera made by the Germans in the 1930s.
For much of last summer, I was away filming in the Spanish island of Mallorca, which seemed like a perfect opportunity to make a film about a very curious camera in a very pretty place.
This is a compromise or a hybrid, somewhere between being a box camera and being a TLR camera. A TLR camera is a camera where you have two lenses, a viewing lens and a taking lens. And they're interconnected, so your focus is transferred from the viewing lens to the taking lens. And what this means is that you have a very simple mechanical camera. The disadvantages of a TLR is often the lenses aren't interchangeable. But on this camera, they're not connected. So compared to, say, a box camera of the day, you've got a shutter which has got a decent number of shutter speeds on it. You've got a decent iris, which you wouldn't have on a box camera, and a decent lens. You've also got a really bright, brilliant viewfinder, which you wouldn't have on, say, a Super Ikonta or something like that. But on a Super Ikonta, you at least have a rangefinder. You can use a rangefinder with this, obviously. But what you're expected to do is use a system called zone focusing. So once you've estimated the distance that you've got to focus at, you have to look at this chart on the side of the camera, and that correlates to a zone. You then have to put that zone in, because there's no feet or meters on the lens, just the zones, and you have to work from there, which is a really overly complicated system. Okay.
The zone focus system wasn't the only absurdly complicated and frustrating thing about this camera. The wind-on, loading and film counter system are just as complicated and just as frustrating.
So when you load the film, you load it, you wind it onto number 1 in the window. Then what you've got to do is push this little button forwards and keep doing it and keep shaking it until this comes down to number 1. And then when you wind it on, you push this one up and you turn it till the number changes, and then it'll click into place and you're on your next shot. I've just put my second roll of film into this camera, and I'm going to get to grips with the wind on. Rather than just losing frames and using the numbers at the back, I'm going to use the latch, and I'm going to trust that when this winds through, that I've moved my 6x6 frame 1 down. So I've just finished the end of my second roll on the Voigtlander. I'm still having trouble with the wind-on mechanism. Sometimes it latches, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I have to use the numbers. So I'm losing quite a lot of shots because of that. And it's a real shame because there's no shortage of beautiful shots around here. The first TLR camera, as I know it, was the Carlton, which was built in 1885. It didn't really take off until the First World War, when German soldiers found that by not looking through the lens that they were shooting through, they weren't as vulnerable to snipers. So it was a gentleman called Reinhold Heideck, I think that's how you pronounce his name, took that away from the trenches, and he designed the first of the Rolleiflexes, which came out in 1929. And that really revolutionized the TLR. And the Rolleiflexes have always been the definitive twin lens reflex camera, even to this day. Now this came out in the early 30s, so not very long after the Rolleiflex. So what it was is a very cheap alternative to that Rolleiflex. It doesn't have many of the features, and as the run of the Brilliant went on, it went from being a metal camera to a Bakelite camera, and they started to mechanically link the viewing lens and the taking lens.
Convinced that I was being really unfair to this camera, I thought I'd give it one last try and put another couple of rolls of film through it. So a couple of days later, I headed down to the port where I was staying and shot off a few more rolls. And while I'm sure I got some great shots, using the camera didn't frustrate me any less second time round than it had the first time.
So that's the end of my experiment with the Voigtlander Brillant. It's a box camera with none of the simplicity of a box camera. It's a TLR camera with none of the functionality.
The results from this camera were really quite good for the most part. When they were sharp, the lens was really nice and had a lovely vintage quality to it. Back when the camera was new, it was a cheaper alternative. So for the photographer using it, there was a much steeper learning curve, but you could get really good results out of it. But today, if you have the choice, I would skip this model altogether and get one of the later true TLR versions, unless you're in it for the challenge. I'm just left with one question. The leather case says Voigtlander Brillant on it, and the camera is called the Brillant. So how did that happen? Answers in the comments, please. I'd love to know.